We all know this story. One day a lawyer asked Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" The lawyer answers his own question: love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus affirms the man's answer, and the scene would be over, except the lawyer was having problems with the neighbor part. And so he asked, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus responds by describing the scene where a certain man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho is robbed, beaten, and left for dead by the side of the road. 3 people came passing by: a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. The first 2, for reasons of their own, pass on by. Those are the more respectable ones, the professional good guys, the ones you would expect to do the right thing. The unexpected one, the Samaritan, responds with kindness and compassion. And at least half of the scandal of Jesus' story is that the Samaritan proves to be the neighbor. That is the story in the Bible. But of course, you don't have to know anything about God or about the Bible to know who the Good Samaritan is and what he stands for. He stands for doing a good deed, for helping a stranger in need. Every once in a while, a Good Samaritan will make the front page of the newspaper. Every once in a while, something happens. Someone gets swept out into a river or stuck in a burning building, and out of a sea of spectators comes a person who does what the moment calls for. They dive into the river or rush into the burning building with no regard for their own safety. They save the day. And usually later, a reporter will catch up with them and ask, "How does it feel to be a hero?" And they will reply with great humility, "Oh, shucks, it was nothing. I am no hero." At least that is what I would say. And I think what we love about these stories is that they are stories about unmerited kindness and compassion and altruism, where someone who has no vested interest in doing anything for someone in need they risk it all to help. So we need these stories because with all the other stories that make the news these days, stories that suggest that the world is a cruel and merciful place to live, we need to hear about kindness and goodness. We need a little light in such a dark world. When we think about the meaning of Jesus' parable for us, we tend to think that what he is saying to us is, okay, everybody, I want you to go out and be like the Good Samaritan. He cared for someone in need. I want you to imitate him. Get busy helping people. Be a Good Samaritan. And that is good advice. And probably the last time I preached on this text, the message was something like that, a go and do likewise kind of sermon. The problem with the message is that it's not enough to let this be a simple moral tale. Be a Good Samaritan. There's more to the story than that. One reason we can't leave it at that is that much of the time, most of us can't do it. We can't, or we won't, or we don't imitate the Good Samaritan. That is why it makes the front of the newspaper when someone does. It's an unusual event. So one problem with making this parable about being a Good Samaritan is that by ourselves, we're not very capable of that sort of thing. The other problem is that there are other characters in this story besides the Samaritan. We know who the Good Samaritan is. Everybody does. We know all about him. But what about the others? Sometimes it is helpful in getting new insight into a familiar Bible passage like this one to think about which character in the story you most identify with. And so there is an outside chance that some of you identify with the priest and the Levite. We don't know much about them, but we can imagine that they are busy people. Their day planners are full. They have a cell phone on their belts that rings constantly. They are in a rush to get somewhere. Who knows, maybe they're going to church. And maybe you can understand that with the pressures of a job and family. You feel like you are always 10 minutes behind for every appointment, and so you really have no time for the guy on the side of the road. You would like to help. You really would, but you're behind. But then, more than likely, and maybe because of the way we've been taught to hear this story, we tend to identify with the Good Samaritan. Or at least we try to put ourselves in his place and hope that we would do what he did. We talk about being a Good Samaritan. But here's the question this morning. What about the one in need? Do we ever identify with the man on the side of the road? Do we ever consider that the guy lying in the ditch is us? In an article she wrote, Judith Brandt tells a story about herself. She writes, "My son is a jazz musician. My husband and I went to hear his band one night at a club in Roxbury. It was a warm, interracial, friendly spot. At the table next to ours, a big, friendly African-American man attended to a tiny, twisted human being on a wheeled cart. A paralyzed man with a puppet's body and a large, misshapen head lay on the cart, sipping his beer through a straw and watching the musicians attentively. He seemed alert, but only his eyes moved, so it was hard to tell how much he really took in. His friend captured our attention. He seemed alive to every nuance of this poor, deformed man. He leaned close to hear him speak in that noisy club, and his manner showed love and care." She writes, "I thought about how wonderful this scene was, this club that embraced this broken person. I felt a part of that embrace. I, too, was reaching out in some way with a friendly smile. I accept you, I was saying. The room was smoky and my contact lenses gave me trouble. I popped them out, sloshed them in my water glass, and put them back in. I was doing a lot of blinking. In a few minutes, the big African-American man came over to our table and gave me a bottle of eye drops. 'Here, you need this.' 'Oh, thanks,' I gushed. 'You noticed.' 'No,' he said. My friend did, pointing to the man on the cart. And on that crooked face was a big grin. He took pity on me." She writes, "I came out of my pharisaical fog. I accept you. What presumption. I thought I was whole, and he was not. I thought I was the giver, and he was the alien, the last person in the world who could help me. But the tables were turned, and that twisted man in the jazz club became an unexpected source of kindness." When we read the parable of the Good Samaritan, are we always so presumptuous as to think that we play the hero in the story? We are the virtuous one, the strong one, the good one, helping the less fortunate. Maybe it is a bit scandalous to suggest that we've got it wrong. Maybe I'm not the Good Samaritan. Maybe I'm the one on the side of the road. Maybe you are the one on the side of the road. That was St. Augustine's interpretation of this parable. Augustine said that the traveler, the one by the side of the road, is every one of us. The Samaritan, the outsider who is greeted with suspicion and even hostility, is Christ. And the inn is the church, the people of God, where broken travelers can be brought in and find rest and be refreshed. Maybe the truth of our lives is that we all experience brokenness. All of us have a disability, maybe not as profound or obvious as the man on the cart in the jazz club, but we're all disabled in some way. I don't know a soul who has not been either directly or indirectly affected by cancer or depression or anxiety. We all carry with us some place of brokenness, a broken dream, a broken heart. And some of the most together people on the outside are falling apart on the inside. Chris Vise was a Presbyterian minister in Waterdown. He was a fine preacher and pastor and a very compassionate and funny human being. Everybody loved Chris. When he was just 37 years old, he was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. As the disease progressed, he had to relinquish his vocation as a congregational minister. He began writing his reflections on his journey of faith and illness. And these reflections were published as a quarterly newsletter and later as a book after he died in 2002. In one of his early reflections, Chris tells of being present at a worship service on Sunday morning. He writes, "We were celebrating Holy Communion that Sunday, and as the minister took the bread and tore it in two, saying, 'This is my body broken for you,' I thought of the brokenness inflicted upon my own body by this disease. And I thought of every person sitting in that sanctuary is broken in some way, whether by illness or divorce, unemployment or betrayal, grief or depression, loneliness or the refusal to forgive. Like Michael Stipe of REM sings, 'Everybody hurts sometime.' All are in need of the new life Christ offers mysteriously through his shattered body and shed blood." Maybe the parable is not a simple morality tale that you could find in Aesop's fables. Be a good Samaritan, be kind, be nice. Maybe the actions of this Samaritan open up a window for us to see the extravagant care and compassion of God for our own lives. And what we discover, if we're honest, is that we're all helpless to be good Samaritans on our own strength. And before we assume that role, we have to realize that in many cases, we're the one on the side of the road, the person in the ditch, the one who lies helpless and wounded. And maybe the word for us this morning is, before we go rushing down the Jericho road, imagining ourselves to be the hero of the story, we need to know the care and compassion of the one who comes to us and tends our wounds. Before we can ever think of going and doing likewise, we need to know the care and the compassion of the one who lifts us up and cares for us, even Jesus Christ.